Good morning, everybody. Dan here. Today we have a Craftsman 6.5 horsepower push mower that came into the shop. The customer is saying that the mower does not start well, if at all, and if he can get it started, it only generally runs for a couple of seconds and stalls out. He said he's never serviced it other than to change the oil and occasionally change the air filter and spark plug. He did just put a new blade on it. So we washed it up. It looks pretty dirty. We're going to take a quick peek at it here. Looking at the identification tag on it, it says it's a 12 cubic inch built in 2003. The code is 123K02-0258-E1, and the date code is 030108. So 2003, January 8th was the manufacture date. So pretty common engine that you see on a lot of Craftsman and other manufacturers in that price range. So we're going to take a look at it. We're going to do a pretty in-depth tune-up on it, and I'm going to try to add a little more detail by some of the feedback I've received on my earlier videos. So here we go. So just looking at the model and serial, that 917.388520. So 917 means Murray, manufactured by Murray for Craftsman. If it was 247, it'd be MTD. Then there's your date code 011503. So first thing we do is pull the top cover off the mower. I've got a couple of Phillips head screws on the top. I'm actually going to replace that pull cord because the mower's about 10 years old and I know that cord is going to break on the guy, so I just cut it. I've got the little metal clamp on the cord, so I know it's not going to rewind on me. I just cut it off, and then when I go to put a new cord on, I'll take the two pieces and measure them out, make it about 6 inches longer, and then have a cord for ourselves. So take the top cover off, the cover off the carburetor as well, and we'll start digging into this thing and see what's going on. So the first thing I'm going to do is pull the air filter cover off here. I believe the customer said he put a new air filter in it. It looks pretty new. Not sure where he got it. I'm going to toss that and put a new one on anyway. So now I'm going to remove the fuel tank. There's a 3/8 bolt underneath. Don't forget that. And then the top three screws are 5/16 fine thread. They have a spacer on them. They're a special screw, so don't lose them and don't drop them down there. Also, when you take the tank off and you're going to take that recoil cover, you have to pull the oil fill tube off. That's the same 5/16 bolt with a spacer built into it. So I pull the tube off and then I just pop it out over the cover and then stick it back into so the oil doesn't leak all over the place. Now I'm going to take the fuel line off, take a look at that fuel line. If this thing is 10 years old, I know it's probably in pretty bad shape, and I'm going to put a new fuel line and clamps on it just for safety's sake. So that goes without saying. We're taking the air filter backing cover off. This is a primer version, so those primer covers tend to warp a little bit, so the primers sometimes don't work well when you put them back together. And I did have some problems putting this one back together to get the primer working. So here we go, and pull off the fuel line. I've got some gas in the tank, and I want to take a look at that gas as well. But if you just take a look at this line, you can see the line's in terrible shape. It's actually all coming apart at one end. So I'll put a new line on it, new clamps as well, when we put it back together. So now I'm going to take off the top shroud. Use 3/8. They're 1/4 20 bolts, 3/8. Usually the two bolts in the front are longer than the two in the back. In this case, they were both the same length, so no worries there. So pull the cover off, and one of the things I always check on these older mowers is the flywheel key. So you can spend a lot of time and a lot of money and a lot of aggravation trying to get this thing to run right, only to find out that the ignition timing is off, and that's because you hit something with the flywheel or hit something with the blade, and the flywheel key partially sheared. So it's really, really common. Some of the folks who are not too familiar with repairing engines will bring things like this to me after they spent a couple $100 trying to solve the problem. So only to find out it's a flywheel key and they didn't even know it existed. So let's move on to something more important, and we'll go into this in detail, the carburetor. So as you can see, the machine's pretty dirty. It's been used for about 10 years, and you get a lot of buildup on the outside of the carburetor, but that doesn't really matter. If you look at the inside of the carburetor, you can see that the air has been filtered properly. The inside of the carburetor is not dirty or covered with debris. A lot of times you'll see people put the filters in wrong, or that this gasket that seals it against the filter container will leak, but this one looks like it's in pretty good shape. Doesn't matter what the outside looks like, and you can clean the outside all you want. It's not going to make any difference in how the carburetor performs. So one thing we also want to note here is on the intake tube, you want to check that to make sure the O-ring is on there. That little black O-ring is actually what seals the carburetor to the intake tube. That O-ring is usually something you can just reuse. I very seldom replace them. That tube is plastic. You want to check that tube for cracks as well, and I'll show you some video of that in the next few minutes. So here's the carburetor sitting on my little welding stand. I'm going to go through it, give it a little bit of a cleanup, just do a visual inspection on it. First thing I'm going to do is dump the fuel that's in that carburetor into a little tin, just so I can see if there's any water in the fuel system. So a good way to determine how well the customer takes care of his equipment. You got a 10-year-old mower here. If there's water in that, I wouldn't be surprised. If there's no water in it, then he's probably pretty careful with his fuel. So I'm just going to dump the fuel out of the carburetor through one of the vents, and just see what the fuel looks like. So it looks pretty clear here. It's not yellow, so I know the guy's been using the machine. And as I dump all the fuel out into it, I didn't notice any water in the fuel at all. So the debris that you see floating in this little tin is just because the tin's dirty, but the fuel itself is fine. Usually it would get cloudy, or you'd actually see like oil and vinegar kind of separated bubbles in that tin, and then you know you've got a issue with water in the fuel. And anytime you have water in the fuel, the water goes right to the bottom of the carburetor. On these Briggs carburetors, since it's got kind of a donut shape on the bottom, the water will settle. But sometimes if you turn a corner or you tip the mower or you're mowing a hill, the first thing that gets pulled in is that water, and that creates like the surface tension across the main jet, and it'll prevent fuel from being pulled in, so it'll kind of stumble and run poorly. So right here, I'm just giving outside a quick cleanup, nothing too fancy, just giving it a little bit of a cleanup. So I let it sit for a little bit. I pick it up, spray it down with a little carb cleaner. I don't really have to take these carbs and soak them in a solution overnight. They're pretty basic carbs. They only run at 1 speed, so you're not too concerned about an idle circuit on them. They're generally very repairable, very rebuildable. So I'm just going to clean the debris off the outside of most of it, give it a good spray with the air hose, and then take it apart. This one looks pretty good. I don't see any dirt inside, like I said. So now we're going to take the main bowl nut off, and that's your main jet metering nut. So inside that is a large hole that allows fuel to run in there, and then a small precision drilled hole, which is your jet size. So it allows the carburetor to mix the fuel at the proper air to fuel ratio. So if you pull that bottom nut off, you get inside the carburetor. And what I see inside of this is really no debris, no water. It's actually very, very clean. It looks like it's in pretty good shape. I'm actually pretty surprised it's that clean. So one thing I want you to notice here is you see how that float sits there in that plastic float? That float should be pretty much level, and you see how it stands up a little bit. I know that the seal in that needle and seat kit in that carburetor, that seal is probably expanded and it doesn't let it sit properly, and that's from ethanol in the fuel. So you have to run some kind of an ethanol treatment in your fuel. You can't use these machines anymore without an ethanol treatment, and I'll show that to you in a second here. So we're just going to pull the needle off the float, and that's just a stainless steel needle, and that little needle goes inside the carburetor and floats with that float, and it allows the carburetor to fill to the proper level, and that maintains a constant level in the carburetor. So I'll show you the mating side of that needle in just a minute. So there's the needle and float and the way it sits in the carb. I'm just trying to show you how it comes apart a little bit. That needle regulates all your fuel by floating up and down with the float, and it rubs up against a rubber seal inside the carburetor. So one thing you do want to do is check on those floats to make sure that they don't have fuel inside them. Sometimes they'll get a crack in them, and you'll have a run-on condition where the machine just constantly leaks fuel because that float doesn't float and shut off the needle. So hold that thing up to the light, and sometimes if you shake them, you can hear a little bit of water in there, or I'm sorry, a little bit of fuel in there. So if that thing's cracked, chuck it, get another one. So right now I'm going to show you how to pull the seal out of the inside the carburetor. The tool I have here is actually a Tecumseh tool. It's their carb tool, and on one side it's got a little hook that's used to reach in and pull that little donut seal out. You see, it's like a dentist tool. That's a nice little tool to have, and it's only about $8. And on the other side is an insertion tool that allows you to insert the seal back into the carburetor. This tool is the Briggs Stratton tool. It's just an insertion tool. It doesn't have a hook on the outside. So the Tecumseh tool is a little nicer. So you can see the little red seal inside there. That's your needle and seat seal. That's the seat. So I'm just going to reach in there with my hook and pull that seal out, and that's all that holds it in. So I can tell by looking at that seal, it is a little bit expanded, and that would explain why the float was not at the proper level, and it was allowing a little bit less fuel into that bowl. So what can happen is, as that thing doesn't shut off properly, you don't get enough fuel in the bowl, and you'll sometimes run out of fuel as you're running. If you're under load, the engine will start to sputter and miss because it doesn't have enough fuel in the bowl, or it may not start properly, or it may not run properly. So you can see how this action works. You see the needle would sit on the float, and that goes up and down, and the fuel runs through that center hole in the donut. And if that donut gets expanded, it doesn't seal right, and also the inside diameter of that donut starts to shrink because all of that material expands. And then as you're using fuel, you can't replenish that fuel quickly enough. So that can be a problem. That's why you have to use like a Startron or Fuel Medic or some kind of ethanol treatment in your fuel to prevent this kind of thing. I see it all the time. So now we're going to take a look at the carburetor itself. This one's in pretty good shape. I really don't see any moisture damage or anything like that. The Welch plugs are in the carburetor. I'm not even going to bother to pull them out. Here's a couple of pointers here. This is your main, that little brass tube is your emulsion tube. It's kind of the main area where the fuel gets pulled out of the carburetor, and it's regulated again by that main nut on the bottom. That's just a bleed for one of the circuits in the carburetor. You want to make sure that's clean. Fill that with fluid, and then use your torch tip tool to clean it out. just give it a quick cleaning. That's the emulsion nozzle from the other side, and that's the bowl nut. And I'll show you when the bowl is off. Just screw that nut on, and that nut, you can see the two holes in the side of that. That's where the fuel goes in, and then in the center of that nut is a precisionally drilled hole, and that's what regulates way inside that big hole. There's actually a precision hole in there, and that regulates how much fuel gets mixed with the air. So it's 12 to 1 or something like that. So now I'm just going to clean this bowl nut off and give it a wire brushing and a quick clean out to make sure that the hole is free of any debris and is clear and allows the right amount of fuel to go through it. Here I'm using my torch tip tool to find a diameter that's close to what's in there. You don't want to open up that diameter, you just want to clean it. If you open it up, you're going to get too rich of a mixture, and you'll either not run at all or you'll be fouling plugs left and right. So just give it a quick cleaning. I run it in and out of there a few times and try to make sure the sides are clean. And then I'm going to hit it with some carb cleaner and polish it up with the wire brush. And then I'll blow it out with my compressed air. You can see the mess from the carburetor in here. I'm just catching all this stuff. I'm not going to put that jet back in there. So here I'm just cleaning up the jet a little bit more. One of the things I notice when you wire brush those jets off is the mating surface where the gasket actually goes for the bowl seal. It's really difficult to get that cleaned off, so I usually just take a razor and give it a scrape and a little bit of wire brushing just to make sure it's clean. If that bowl seal leaks, you'll have a gassy smell all the time near that lawnmower, so that's something you want to avoid. I always use a new seal on that. They're a couple of dollars, $2 or $3. Nobody makes an aftermarket seal. You have to buy them from Briggs, and their parts are expensive. But hey, if you're going to do it right, do it once, and just know it's done. So here I'm cleaning it out, gave it a wire brush and blowing. I'm just trying to show you. Sometimes you can actually see down there and see the tiny, tiny hole. But I'm not too familiar with this camera, so the only thing I saw there was a little bit more debris on it. And I'm filming this upside down, so it's a little hard for me to get the camera to show all the parts I want. So this looks pretty clean. I seldom have to replace these unless they're really, really clogged or they've been sitting in water and debris for years. So here I'm going to clean up the bowl. Just on the passages on the top of the bowl with the ring on the top, I run my fine stainless steel brush on it to loosen the debris, hit it with some carb cleaner, make sure it's all clean, wipe it out with a rag really well, and then I hit it with the compressed air. Nothing cleans them out like compressed air. So these bowls have some kind of an anodized coating on them, and I try not to scratch that coating. It seems to work really well, keep the fuel clean, and keeps it from oxidizing. So this bowl is nice and clean. The bottom area where the main jet seats is clean. You see a little bit of black on the bowl. That's just paint from the factory. When they paint the engines, they usually hit them with some black paint, so no worries on that. Here's the large O-ring on the top of the bowl, seals the bowl against the carburetor. I'm going to take that off and replace it. A lot of times you can reuse it. I have plenty of them, so I'm going to replace it. The face here is for the air filter mounting bucket, and that bracket that kind of fits against the air filter. So I mentioned earlier had some issues with priming on this. It didn't prime well. So the way it primes is when you hit that primer button, it pushes a jet of air down into the carburetor bowl, and the pressure in the bowl forces the fuel to shoot out of the main jet or the emulsion tube inside the carburetor, and just puts a little raw fuel up there. So when you pull it, it can pull that raw fuel in. Well, these things are a pain in the ass. They as they get older, those carburetor where the carburetor mounts against that air filter housing starts to get warped and the seal doesn't work well between the gasket and the housing. So here I'm just going to clean this up a little bit, and I'm actually going to hit it with a big flat file just to flatten that surface a little bit. I'm just going to take a couple of quick passes on it just to make sure it's all straight and flat, and that'll give me a better chance of getting that primer backing cover to seal properly. Once I file it, I take it back up to the tank, wash it all out, blow some carb cleaner through it, and blow a lot of compressed air through it. You can see a couple of those shavings on the ground, but that's it. That's all I'll do to it, just a quick hit. So I sprayed it all out, rinse it out, blow it with compressed air, and then we can start putting everything back together. And just check those passages to make sure that nothing got in there. Put my little torch tip cleaner tool in there to clean it out, and then blow everything out with compressed air. You can see the air blowing through. That's just a vent to the outside air pressure. And my torch tip cleaner, I put through that little hole just to make sure there's no debris in there. This carburetor was actually pretty clean, so I'm not worried about it. And again, these carbs don't run at idle or anything like that. They're just set to run with a governor at 3100 RPM, so you don't have to worry about the idle circuit in them being clogged or being finicky. So most of the time you can reuse these carbs. I seldom have to replace them. So here I'm showing you the needle and seat. That's the old needle and seat. That's the old gasket. That's the old O-ring. And the cleaned up parts. So the first thing we're going to do now is reassemble the carburetor. And that's going to start with the needle and seat. That's a rubber, or like a Viton rubber seat, and the new stainless steel needle comes in a kit. That's about $4 or $5 from Briggs Stratton. I always use the Briggs ones because some of the aftermarkets are not compatible with higher ethanol. That's the main bowl seal for the bowl nut. Those you can't buy aftermarket. You have to buy from Briggs. They're expensive. They're about $2 a piece. But they always seem to work, so I haven't found a vendor that has those same gaskets. So here I've got the new needle and seat and the bowl gasket out. When I bring all these parts out, I try to put them on a nice clean rag, on a nice clean area. A lot of times it's hard to find a clean spot in the shop, but you have to make it clean. If you get any debris in the carburetor when you're assembling it, you're bound to have problems down the road. It may run fine today, but in a couple of weeks that debris floats around and finds a home somewhere. So this is a new bowl gasket O-ring. I'm going to use that new O-ring, put that on the carb. And that's the Briggs carb seat insert tool. That tool is used to push the new seat into the carburetor hole. That's a tool that's made by Briggs & Stratton. Now this is another carb rebuild kit at 498260. This kit covers several carburetors with adjustable jets. It's kind of an old school kit, but it has all the parts you would need to rebuild this carburetor, and then some extra parts. So it has all the Welch plugs, a different bowl gasket, some cork gaskets for the air filter. I don't recall exactly what this one fits, but it fits a whole bunch of different carburetors, and it'll work on this one as well. So it's got the needle seat, the O-ring for the mounting, that air filter, that cork air filter gasket for some of the older style machines. So I keep these kits around too. Sometimes I get in an adjustable carburetor and I can use these kits. They're a couple dollars more than the other two kits, but they're just more convenient. I just try to keep them in the shop so I have them. And that's the bowl seal that comes in that kit as well. Same thing as you'd buy in individual from Briggs. So just thought I would show you that kit. On that O-ring, what I do is I rub my fingers on my face and I put a little bit of the oil from my face on that O-ring before I put it on. Just rub it around, just a tiny bit of lubrication, so when you put the bowl on, it slides right on. And not a big deal on the Briggs carburetors, but on the Tecumseh carburetors, they have a bigger gasket and the bowl's a little tighter. I can't tell you how easy the bowl slides on with a little bit of oil from your face on it. So that's one of my little tricks. This is the O-ring, or the main needle and seat. You'll notice that one side is flat and clear, the other side has a groove in it. That groove side goes toward the inside of the carburetor, so you want to put that groove side up into the hole, so when you're all assembled and you're looking at the carburetor all finished, you just see the smooth side down in that hole pointing out toward the needle. So it's kind of hard to show you the installation, but basically you put that on there, you put that donut on there, and then you use that tool to just push it in. Just push it in there snug. You don't have to go crazy. And that's just like a 3/16 or so diameter shaft that they use to push it in. That tool is actually from Briggs. So I'll put the seat in, and then we'll begin assembling the rest of the carburetor. Now here I've got the new seat. I'm going to put it on the Tecumseh tool with the rings facing inward. I'm just going to use that Tecumseh tool to get it stuck down into the hole, and then I'll back it out and use the Briggs tool to seal it. If you don't have a tool, you can use a little drill bit. Just use the back of like a 3/16 drill bit. There you go. You see the seat's pushed in there. It's all ready to go. So now I'm going to take my float, inspect it, make sure it doesn't have any leaks, make sure it's nice and clean. And I'm going to put my new needle on the seat. These are plastic seats, so that are plastic floats, so they're really not adjustable. So all the components are designed to just be at the right size and height. So if I put that new needle on the float and then drop the float into the hole and the needle into the hole and then put the pin through, I should be good to go. And you'll notice the float is just pretty much level with parallel with the body of the carburetor once it's all installed with the new parts. If it's not parallel, you may have not pushed the seat down all the way, so you want to check that. Sometimes I do that oil trick and put a little bit of, rub that seat on my face before I stick it in there, just to give a little bit of lubrication as it goes down the hole. I don't want to use any heavy lubrication or anything that'll really stay in there. So I know that oil is biodegradable. So here we go. We've got the pin in. You see that the float, with the float all the way closed, it's pretty much the bottom of the float's parallel with the carburetor. If you took it apart and that float was all bulging out, that meant your seat had expanded, most likely due to ethanol or some other engine cleaning formula that you put in there. I can't tell you how many of those things I see. These people buy this mechanic in a bottle and it just destroys everything, and then I have to take it apart anyway. So don't waste your money. Use ethanol treatment in your fuel. So that looks good. I think we're ready to go there. So now we're going to put the bowl on the carburetor. Got the rubber O-ring toward the top of the carburetor. It's all in place. Everything is installed. The needle's in there, the seat's in there, the pin's in there, the float's in there, the bowl's nice and clean. So I'm just going to put that right over the center. Then I'm going to put my seal on there and take my cleaned off main jet or bowl nut and hand thread it in there. Make sure you hand thread it, make sure it goes in straight. You don't want to force that or you're going to just ruin the carburetor. I always take a look around the sides of the carburetor to make sure the bowl's on nice and straight. You can see the reveal around the bowl is all the same, and you're good to go. So that's a 1/2 inch nut. Snug it down with your hand, and then I take a deep socket, 6-point socket, and then just put it on there and snug it up. Make sure the seat's in the middle. Make sure everything looks good so it seals up. And then I just give a little bit of a twist with the, with the ratchet. You don't have to hammer it down. You can just turn it, and then all of a sudden you'll just feel it kind of stop. So there's a little pressure on the bowl itself, but in the center of the bowl, it actually, ends up stopping against that protrusion inside the carburetor there. So it looks good. So now it's really all cleaned up. It's ready to go back on the engine itself. So let's get the carburetor air filter base cover ready to mount to the carburetor. So if you take a look at the gaskets here, you just want to make sure that you have the right gaskets. There's 2 or 3 different styles. I'm going to clean off this cover and clean up the area where the gasket mounts, and then we'll put the gasket on. So you take a look at this primer system. You push in on that primer, the air blows through there, it meets up with the gasket, and then that gasket brings that airflow up to an input in the carburetor. It's on that face that we cleaned up, and I'll show you that hole is right on the face, right below that mounting screw, right there where my finger is. So what happens is you push on that primer and it blows air into that hole. It doesn't blow gas. The air goes down through a passageway, blows air into the bowl, and then the bowl shoots gas up through that mixing tube. And then you get a little bit of gas down in the carburetor that sits there. So when you pull it, that raw gas is there to prime the engine. So these things could be a pain in the neck to get to work when they get old, because that long bottom area there where the gasket is, that kind of squared off or rectangular area, that thing doesn't seal up flat against the carburetor, you won't be able to prime. And I see that happen a lot of times. So sometimes you have to just buy this whole new backing plate and replace it. Also, the Sten's gaskets for this backing plate are thicker, and for some reason they just do not seem to work. So if you have problems, maybe because you're using a Sten's gasket, they look identical, they're a hair thicker, and they just don't seem to work. So that carburetor fits onto that just like that once it's mounted on the engine. So I'm just showing you how it mates up there. That's where your air comes through and meets up with your carburetor, right in that small hole. When you prime that engine, sometimes you can look in the carburetor there and you'll see a little bit of fuel start to drip out there. So, or just kind of puddle up there. It doesn't usually drip, but it does puddle up. If you hit the primer a few times and you get some wetness in there, then that's good. You're all good to go. That's all you need. As they get older, they just generally don't seem to prime as well because the plastic starts to warp and it just doesn't hold the seal as well. Okay. So here's some of the parts we used. The O-ring for the bowl. This gasket to meet the air cleaner cover. The needle and seat. And then the main jet O-ring So those things, all those pieces you'll get in that larger kit if you buy that kit, or you can buy all those pieces separately. Usually in the Briggs kits, it makes sense to buy the kit that contains all those pieces, because the parts are much cheaper if you buy them in a kit. But sometimes you can't find them like that, and you have to buy them individually. So, and again, I recommend using the Briggs parts on all of these carburetor pieces. Aftermarket stuff just doesn't fit well, or they're not as tolerant of ethanol in the fuels. So if you're going to do all this work, you may as well use the original Briggs parts, unless you're in a bind and you're out in the middle of nowhere and it's all you have. So here we have the mounting area for the carburetor. I just wanted to make sure that you notice that rubber O-ring is on there. Sometimes they fall off when you pull the carb off. You'll get a vacuum leak if you don't have it on there. That O-ring comes in that larger rebuild kit. Here's the governor arm. If you are interested in how the governor works, there's a great explanation on the Briggs website. Basically, there's a set of weights inside the machine. As the machine spins faster, as the engine spins faster, puts a greater force on that bar and keeps that spring in tension. And as the engine slows down, that spring wins the battle and pulls the throttle plate open. So it's a constant mechanical governor that keeps your engine at a constant speed. And it actually works pretty well. Now everything's controlled by computers, RPM, tach sensors, things like that. But this mechanical governor system's been around for hundreds of years, and it works quite well. This adjustment here is your throttle speed adjustment on this engine. That's the only thing you want to touch on this engine in terms of setting the speed. And when we get the carb back on and everything assembled, I'll set this engine to 3,000, 3,100 RPM, something like that. I think the spec is 3,100, so I set it a tiny bit low. So that's how you set the speed. Once it's set, you never touch it. It's start and go. So now I want to show you a little quick shot of the rest of the governor. You can see the shaft that comes out of the back of the engine. That's the shaft that puts the turning force on that arm, and that's the centrifugal speed regulator that's inside the engine. It's just a set of weights that spin around and push up against that as the engine speed increases and decreases. So here's the carburetor mounting bolts. We're going to mount the carburetor back up to the mounting flange. We've got our O-ring in place. If you notice, there's one bolt underneath those two spots for the carburetor. That bolt sometimes breaks and allows that carburetor mounting flange to come loose. You want to just check that, make sure that it's snug. So we're just going to thread these in and start them. I've got a little 3/8 drive I start them with. Make sure we don't get any of that dirty debris on the inlet to the fuel. So we'll just snug them up, and then I'll hit them quick with the wrench. I just throw a couple of foot-pounds on them. You only need about 5 or 8 pounds on them. It doesn't have to be super tight, and you don't want to strip them for sure. So there we go. Carburetor's all mounted up. There's one last thing I did want to show you. This intake tube from the carburetor, it goes under the coil and over to the intake port on the block. That tube is actually plastic. It's not super durable. It's some kind of phenolic plastic. It's very hard, but once in a while you get some erratic running and you find a crack in that tube where it's pulling air in, so it doesn't mix right. You get a lean mixture. You'll notice the plug is kind of white. So that's something you just want to check while you have the cover off. They have a couple different styles, and the latest part fits both of those styles. Alright, let's button this thing up. So while I have this mower in the shop, I'm going to put a new pull cord on it because I know this pull cord's 11 or 12 years old and it will break on this guy eventually. So I'm just going to pull the cord out and leave the tension on the spring. I know I don't have to rewind the spring if I pull it all the way out and just refeed a new cord in it. So I pull it out, stick a screwdriver through the mesh there, and then cut the cord. And then I'm going to take the old cord pieces and then lay them out, and I'll cut myself a new piece of cord with a couple inches extra on it for the nuts, and then hit it with WD-40 and put it back on the engine. So now I've got the old pull cord. I'm going to pull the old rope through it, pull it out, cut the knot off, and then pull the cord through. These old pliers do a terrible job, so I'm going to grab my stainless steel cutters from Harbor Freight. These things work the nuts. They're $8 or $10. They never go on sale, and I use them to cut rope all the time. Bingo. Nice and clean. Now I'm going to take those two pieces of rope I have and lay them out, cut myself a new piece of rope, and rethread it. So I got the old rope together and laid it up against my new Briggs Stratton number 5 rope. Leave a little bit for knot tying. Take both sections and just kind of run them out and cut the same length off. I'm not going to worry about putting that metal clamp back on for folding up the mower. So, okay, so I've got a great piece here now. Next thing I'm going to do is grab my torch. I hit the ends. This rope is very high quality, so it takes a hot flame to melt it. I melt it and then just rub it with a rag. Make sure you have a rag. Don't try that trick with your hands or your pants, or you'll be you run screaming out of the garage because that plastic gets really, really hot. That's some kind of a nylon or something. So I got a nice little tip on there to feed through, and I should be able to thread that back right through the cover here and have no problem doing that. So I'm going to take my good rope here and thread it through the hole, bring it through there and tie it in a knot. So I put a knot on this side, just one single knot is fine. Try not to leave too much outside past the knot so it doesn't get tangled in the recoil assembly. And then take your screwdriver out to let the load out. The other thing I like to do is hit it with a little WD, just a couple of spots near the cams for the starter drive, and also I try to put a little bit in the top spring, and if you can see where the spring attaches to the plastic rotator recoil right there, you just put a couple of squirts down there, and then tip the cover right side up so that falls down onto that spring, and that'll keep the spring from rusting up if you end up leaving it outdoors a few times. But gives it makes it operate nice and smoothly. So now I just let the spring pull the cord back in. I'm good to go. I'm going to tie a little knot in that to keep it from going in, and then once I put the shroud back on the engine and the plastic cover over it, I'll be able to just pull that cord out, take that knot out, put my handle on, and be good to go. Okay, so now I've got the gas tank I took off the machine about an hour ago. I noticed the fuel line was pretty bad, so I cut a new piece of fuel line. Got a couple of clamps for it as well. And I'm going to put the clamps over the hose so they're on there so I don't forget. And I blew the line out so it's nice and clean. One thing I want to do before I change that hose is I'm going to take what fuel's in that tank and I'm going to pour some of it out into a pan here just to see what it looks like, to see what kind of fuel was in there. One thing I noticed right away is that fuel's barely coming out, and if I loosen the gas cap up, it's pouring out like crazy. So I know I've got a problem with the gas cap not venting, so that was most likely half this guy's problem. He'd used the fuel that was found its way down to the carburetor, but as you use it quicker than you can deliver it, it stalls out. I can't tell you how many times you find a problem this simple, especially on like a snowblower in the winter. They get iced up and they won't vent, and people will chase their tail on these things forever. One of the other things I'm checking here is to take a look in this fuel to see what it looks like, to see if this has any water or anything bad in it. Sometimes you can smell chemicals like dry gas, things like that people put in it. This fuel actually looks good. There's no water or anything abnormal in here. The debris you see in the pan is just from the pan being dirty. Even though we didn't have any water in the last tank, I want to show you what water looks like. So I put a little water in this gasoline. I'm going to show you what it looks like in the gas. So it'll appear cloudy, or if it's settled like this, it'll just appear as like an oil bubble down at the bottom of the tank. You can see that little oil field down at the bottom underneath the gas. It's heavier than the gasoline, so you can see there's just water in the bottom. If you get that in your carburetor, that will go right to the bottom of the carburetor and clog your main jet, so you'll have intermittent running or stumbling, sputtering, won't start. That water has a real high surface tension, so it doesn't allow the fuel to go through. So just wanted to show you what that looks like. In this case, it looks like the guy's taking good care of his fuel. He's had it for 10 years. There was no water in it whatsoever. So I'm going to give him an A+ on his water and fuel level. Okay, so now we're going to swap the fuel line out on the tank. There's still a little fuel in the tank, but I just tip it back. I'm going to save the fuel that's in there, just kind of tip it back, and let what little fuel is in there sit in the back end of the tank. I'm going to slide the new fuel line on and put the clamp on it, slide the clamp down. I always use new clamps because the clamps are funny. They break all of a sudden. They look like they're fine and then they just break. So we're going to give this a go. One thing I'm going to do before I put the tank back on is just make sure that it flows fuel okay, and flow any debris that might be in that line. And of course, I know I've got a bad fuel cap on this one, so I'm going to put a new fuel cap on it. And I'm going to use a Briggs OEM cap. It's a 692046. They're only a couple of bucks, and I buy them in 5, so they don't cost too much. A little bigger cap, a little nicer cap, so I'm going to put that cap on and make sure that the tank flows properly with that cap on. This may be an aftermarket cap he had on there. So this newer cap has more of a plastic gasket than a rubber gasket, so it's less likely to be damaged by ethanol. So let's see how this flows. Okay, great. So there's not much gas in the tank, but it's still flowing out pretty well, so I think we're good to go here. So next we're going to put the cover on the engine shroud. There are 4 1/4-20 bolts with 3/8 heads on them. Make sure that you have the lower shroud cover near the back of the carburetor engaged properly, and you want to slide the oil fill tube onto the top of that. Make sure you put a 5/16 1032 screw in there. It's a shoulder screw. So we'll get that cover put on, tighten it up, show you the 4 bolts here. They're just 1/4-20. They're like 3/4 inch. Sometimes the front 2 are longer. I usually hit these with a couple with a spray of WD-40 because something about sending them into that aluminum case. In the front there, they do sometimes bind up because it's so dry in there. So just to be careful, we'll throw a little WD on them and thread them in. And then we'll get them all put in and hit them with the impact driver, snug them up. Either 8 or 12 foot-pounds is plenty. They don't need a ton of torque to hold on, but I just run the gun at a light setting, so here we go. And then we'll switch over to the 5/16. I'll show you that's a shoulder bolt. You see there's a shoulder on there so you can't crush the plastic. Make sure you put that on or you'll have oil all over the place as soon as you start that engine. That holds the fill tube in place. Okay, good. So we're good to go here. This is the fuel tank mounting screw for the lower right hand side. There's a spacer that goes between the tank and the engine, and then you put the bolt through there. You want to make sure that you don't forget that spacer. So I'm going to slide the fuel line on, put the clamp on because I do have a little bit of fuel in there. I just want to make sure I don't lose any of that fuel. And then I'm going to start mounting the tank. I usually thread that lower spacer and bolt that's below the tank. I usually thread that on first. Just get it started finger tight, make sure it's not cross-threaded, and get that started in there. Then I go to the top and I take the remaining 3 shoulder bolts. There are 5/16 heads on them, and load those up on the top of the tank. There's 3 locations for those. Put those on. That holds they hold the tank on the top. Sometimes they will lock in there, and you got to kind of beat on them to get them out. Or sometimes you have to pull them through their mounting of plastic, and then use a washer to get them back on. But most of the time they come out okay. Again, don't over torque them. I know it looks like I'm using a lot of power on this thing, but I'm not. So I'm going to go down below and torque up that lower one now. Just give it a quick tighten. So we're good to go. Now we're going to put the air cleaner backing plate on that has the primer in it. I've got the gasket in place. I'm going to make sure I get my PVC breather tube into the back of the air filter plate. That pulls a crankcase ventilation gases in to burn through the engine again to help it burn a little bit cleaner. So got my 3 fine thread screws. Whenever you put these in, try to start them by hand. Make sure they're going in straight because you can cross thread them really easily, and then you're in a lot of trouble trying to get the plate to mount, especially if you have a primer plate like this. Some of them come through as a choke, or some of them come through as a mechanical choke, and some have a vane choke on them with a heater coil for the muffler on them, and they're not so critical. But when you have these primer ones, you have to make sure it mounts up nice and smooth. So looks like we're in good shape here. Let's start getting the rest of this thing together, get it running. So let's get the air filter put on. Put a new filter in here. Make sure it's all set properly. Seal up. Close the cover up. Snug it up. And we should be good to go there. I'm going to change the plug in this. Earlier I did a leak down test to make sure the cylinder was holding pressure, but I didn't put it on the video. Take a look at this plug and it'll give you a little indication of why I knew we had a fuel delivery problem. Take a look at the plug, see how white the tip is and how clean the plug is. I can tell the engine is starving for fuel. That should be a little darker gray. So I know it was burning awfully lean. So I'm going to put a new plug in. It's a RJ19LM plug, pretty standard, like a CJ8 or J8C. you know, from years gone past. Just a J8 kind of plug for L-head engines. So now I'm going to start it up, and I threw the tack on it. The spec calls for about 3100 RPM for top no load speed, so I'm just going to adjust this thing to just under 3100 RPMs. So I'm adjusting it here, and I've got just about 20 RPMs. It'll probably raise up a little bit once it warms up, but that's pretty good. I don't want to go too high. If you run them too high and people run them low on oil, they tend to overheat really fast. So no harm running it at 3000 RPM. So I just went back to the online docs for this, and it tells you the top no load speed is 3100 RPMs, and the engine is that's the engine number up top there, that 123 KO2. So that'll cover it. Thanks for watching. Please comment in the comment section. Thanks.